Okay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ron Fletcher, who has been very gracious and kind to join us. Dr. Fletcher has significant number of years experience in research as well as in medical field as an oncologist. And he's done research with AIDS virus, and since AIDS, also now with COVID, and has developed a paper discussing the value that vitamin D3 plays. And today, Dr. Fletcher will also give us an update on the vaccines. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Fletcher.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to have you here. Obviously, the number one topic in the news is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it's being halted as far as therapy. So this morning, I want to talk about the vaccines, not just Johnson & Johnson, but all the vaccines, and kind of give you a summary of what is going on and what you can expect. Then I want to talk about factors that are going to impact treatment, including vaccine treatment. That's meaning the mutations that have occurred. And then I'm going to talk about several other topics that are germane to this whole thing. So first of all, let's talk about the vaccines. So currently there have been 3 approved drugs, vaccine drugs for the United States. One of them uses something called a viral vector method of vaccine protection. And this is the Johnson & Johnson. Viral vector methods have been used for quite some time and pretty much are what they're used for standard flu therapies. So all of these vaccines have one purpose, and that purpose is to help the body identify a foreign invader. And in this case, the foreign invader is COVID-19. If we're having a business meeting and everyone's wearing a gray suit and someone who is a spy for another corporation decides to come in and he's wearing a gray suit, well, he can come on in and do his damage. But let's say someone puts a tag on his suit that says, "I am not supposed to be here." Well, then he's recognized and he's ejected from that meeting. And that's what these vaccines are trying to do. So a viral vector uses a very harmless virus, adenovirus, which is pretty much a common cold virus. So we know it's compatible in the human system, but it doesn't really cause any harm. Now, this harmless virus teaches the cell to produce a harmless piece of a particular protein associated with the COVID virus. And this is the spike protein. And it's what we call an antigen or a foreign substance. So the virus, the adenovirus, the harmless virus, teaches the cell to produce this piece. This piece is displayed, and the body's immune system can identify this piece, like putting a "I don't belong here" sign on the virus. Once that happens, then the immune system can attack that virus. And once that happens, the immune system can remember that this is a foreign substance that needs to be attacked and from which the body needs protection. So that's basically a viral vector. It uses a virus, a harmless virus, to Trojan horse and to trick the virus to expose itself. Now, the other vaccines, which are the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, they're based on a fairly new technology. It's actually been around for quite some time, but it's recently been used because of the urgency of necessity with regard to COVID. Now, this is called an mRNA vaccine, M meaning messenger. And essentially, this uses a messenger RNA to give instructions to the immune system. And again, these immune systems make little changes to make the virus, I'm pixelating here, to make the virus identifiable. So both of these systems are doing the same thing. They're just doing it in a different way. One uses a common harmless virus. The other uses messenger RNA to instruct the cells to do something to help the body's immune system recognize that COVID is a foreign invader. Now, a lot of people have been concerned about, well, this is mRNA, so is this going to cause me to grow a third eye or, 6 toes or something? It does not enter the cell's nucleus, and so it doesn't interfere with your DNA. It simply makes a harmless piece of the virus that can be recognized. So those are the differences between the two viruses, between the two vaccines. So one, as I mentioned, is viral vector. That's the Johnson & Johnson, and also it's used in the AstraZeneca vaccine. The others, the Moderna and the Pfizer, use the mRNA. Now, as far as the clotting is concerned, clotting has not been noticed in the mRNA vaccines, but it has been noted in the viral vectors. So again, there's some interesting aspects with regard to the viral vector. And one of the things that I've noticed is that with the AstraZeneca, we found, and I'll just call it AZ, we found clots earlier, and they were a bit more frequent than we're seeing with the Johnson & Johnson. Now, I was trying to figure out why that might happen, and this is something of interest. So the Johnson & Johnson viral vector uses a human adenovirus, but the AZ vaccine uses a chimpanzee adenovirus. So there is a different species utilized. And I wonder, could that have some bearing with regard to unusual or adverse events? I might also mention that you've heard about the Sputnik, the Soviet Union's, the Russian vaccine, and that's also based on a viral vector. And we don't really have a whole lot of information regarding that. And so that's not unusual for the Russians. With regard to the AZ virus, we first noted clotting quite some time ago. And as it was going up for approval in the EU, because of noticing these clotting difficulties, they sort of paused and took their time with regard to approving it. And that's probably wise. There have been some studies that have shown that although 25 million doses have been given in the EU, there have been a lot more problems with clotting. Now, there was a study that looked at women in Germany and Austria, or not just women, but people. They found 28 cases of clotting, and 6 of them died. Now, we know with the Johnson & Johnson, there have been about 7 million doses given, and there have been 6 cases with 1 death. And in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, all of these cases, all these deaths have been in women. In the AZ trial, there were women and men, but women were outstanding, the majority. So the risk-benefit ratio is very, very great with regard to benefit for the Johnson & Johnson. So again, 6 cases, 7 cases, or 6 cases, 7 million deaths. So that's about a 0.00000088% risk, or about 1 in a million. So it falls within safety concerns, but again, we have to look more at this to try to find out what the true extent of this is. And so I think the pause is very wise, and because the FDA and because scientists look at safety as a most important aspect of any therapy, I think it was necessary to restore the confidence of individuals who have heard about this clotting. Now, trying to get to why this clotting is happening, when we first see a phenomena, we try to see, is there something similar that we can identify that may yield the same sort of responses? And with regard to this particular clotting difficulty, we've seen something similar to this. There's a medication called heparin, and this is a blood thinner medication that's used very commonly. If you've had a surgery, if you have to be bedridden and non-mobile for quite some time, the potential for you to develop a clot is great. And so they give heparin, usually in low doses, to keep the blood thin so clots do not form. However, we have noticed that in very rare cases, some individuals, when exposed to heparin, actually do the opposite. They start to develop clots, and the clotting is associated with the platelets, and platelets are the types of cells in the blood that are responsible for clotting. So these platelets are affected and they become clumped together. This clumping together essentially reduces the total number of platelets because instead of individuals, you see one large group. So the total number is reduced. And then, as I mentioned, for reasons that we still don't fully understand and probably are far too complicated for this discussion, they cause clots, thrombus. And so this is a phenomenon in which we have a low platelet count caused by clumping, not by the destruction of the platelets and the formation of clots. Now, heparin is a very common blood thinner, and we know that there are other things that can do the same thing. There are certain antibiotics, there are other medicines that can do this, but heparin appears to be the archetype for study and discussion. Again, it's very rare, but I've looked at statistics, and the statistics aren't really that great, but it can be as high as 1 to 3% of individuals who receive heparin that can have this difficulty. But again, as you look at different data, you see different information because there's not really been a large prospective study to look at the overall occurrence of this phenomenon because it's relatively well known. But because it is similar to heparin, we have the term for this heparin-induced clotting thrombosis called heparin-induced thrombosis. So now we have the term of vaccine-induced thrombosis and thrombocytopenia. So that's what we're seeing as a phenomenon. Now, I would mention that this has only been identified in the viral vector type vaccines. There has been no such report in the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. So those seem to be not causing the clots. So it seems to be that type of phenomena based on the medicine. And as I said, it's my opinion that because they're using a non-human adenovirus, that may be why we're seeing more clotting in the AZ as opposed to the Johnson & Johnson, which uses a human adenovirus. Now, I might add that clotting has been a difficulty associated with COVID for quite some time. We knew that a number of people were dying. The majority of them were dying because they had these overwhelming pulmonary infections, these sudden acute respiratory syndrome phenomena. But we also started noticing that in younger individuals, generally between 40 and 50, that we started seeing clot formations. And these clots were causing death, heart attacks, strokes, and other phenomena. We also noted that those individuals who had the clots associated with COVID-19, when they were treated with heparin, then they had this similar circumstance of clotting in about almost 7% of the cases. They developed this HIT. So this definitely has something to do with the immune system. So it has to do with the vaccine, it has to do with heparin, and it has to do with the immune system, and perhaps something that is being triggered by the virus in its response to the vaccine. We don't have enough information at this time. That's still being evaluated. And we may not know for quite some time what the exact mechanism is, but we've kind of found out some things with regard to what happens, why COVID causes these vaccines. With the AstraZeneca, we've noted some interesting aspects. And one thing I'd like to mention is when we take a look at all these studies, we do these common cohort studies. And I remember in pain management, which I worked in for quite some time, we'd been going for decades and decades and had not really thought about, wow, men and women may be different. So why are we looking at men and women in the same way? Are there some little things that might be different than women? Yes, there are. So take a look at it. So we went back on our data and we found that there were phenomena, there were factors in women that were different than men. Duh, right? So we actually, from that information, found out that there were particular aspects of pain medicine that needed to be modified to get a better successful treatment with women. And that's the case with the vaccines. You haven't heard a whole lot about the difference between how women react and how men react. Certainly, we've heard a lot about pregnancy. And with regard to pregnancy, the verdict is still out. We don't have enough data on that. But what we do have is data on women and their response. We're trying to get more and more data. So first of all, women have more side effects than men. When we take a look at the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, we noticed that there were 66 cases of anaphylaxis. And anaphylaxis is that severe immune response that can be seen with medications and which can be seen with vaccines. These are responses in which individuals get wheezing and swelling and a lot of different things. And it actually becomes a medical emergency that has to be treated immediately or the patient could die. Now, of these 66 cases of anaphylaxis, 63 were in women. So that kind of lets you think about things. With regard to the AstraZeneca difficulty and the clotting associated with that, 2/3 of the people that developed clots were women. So women have a greater sensitivity than men with regard to the vaccine. And no one has really taken a look as to why this is, although people are starting to understand, probably because there are more women in medicine and research now than before. So women tend to mount a greater immune response. And so that is something that we've not really noticed before. Women have better systems. So I guess we can say women are stronger than men in a number of ways. But the data on women overall is poor. Estrogen is the most common factor that we sort of look at to define the difference between men and women. And estrogen tells the cells to make antibodies after a vaccine has been given. Men don't have that. There's another mechanism that men use, but that's an interesting phenomenon. The other thing that I can take a look at is and let you know is that women between the ages of 18 and 48 seem to be the ones that have the greatest risk for this vaccine-related difficulty. They also tend to be the ones at greatest risk for the heparin-induced thrombus. And one of the factors that's associated with an increased risk for this heparin-induced thrombus is taking birth control pills, which is, again, a hormone. So is this phenomena something that's associated with hormones? And should we start to take a look at women who are taking birth control and perhaps make a recommendation that if you're on birth control, if you're on hormones, maybe you might want to have a discussion about using the vaccines that are viral vector based? It's too early to tell, but again, this is something that we're researching and taking a look at. The other phenomena with regard to this is when we see clots, the majority of these clots are in the locations of the lower extremities, in the legs. Venous thrombosis in the calf area is very, very common. Very, very common if someone is at bed rest, if someone has had a surgical procedure and cannot ambulate. This is the notable area of clot formation. However, with this phenomena that we see that has been identified in these viral vector vaccines, the clots are in unusual locations. We've seen clotting in the GI system, but we've also seen clotting in the cavernous venous sinuses. It's called cavernous venous thrombosis, which is a very, very dangerous and lethal phenomena. Those are the sinuses that drain the brain. And so to have a thrombus in that area has a dire consequence on brain circulation, can cause strokes and a number of other phenomena. So it's not just the clotting that is unusual, it's the location of the clotting that's unusual. Now, one other thing that I can say with regard to the fact that we see so much of this clotting that occurs in the GI system, the GI system is a particularly potent source for immune response. Let me get rid of this. For immune response. So again, this obviously is associated with the immune system, something that the vaccine, and particularly the vaccine with regard to the COVID virus, because as I mentioned, COVID virus has in itself been associated with clotting. And COVID patients that have been treated with heparin have a higher potential to develop clotting. So it's starting to make an interesting circle of origin, but that's going to have to be taken care of for quite some time. Now, one of the areas in which I've done a lot of research is vitamin D. And what I can say is in my paper, because I was trying to address the clots that occur from COVID-19, I mentioned that vitamin D not only helps the immune system to mount a response, and it moderates and modulates the immune system so that response is not overwhelming to the body and causes severe difficulties like a cytochrome storm, which is a rampant overactive immune response that can cause death. Vitamin D helps to modulate that. But also vitamin D has an effect on thrombus formation, thrombus being the clots that occur. So vitamin D tempers that and helps reduce that. So another indication that probably vitamin D is not such a bad thing to do. It's safe, it's cheap, it's effective, it's out there. One of the problems that I'm picking up with regard to the Johnson & Johnson recall, and it's not really a recall, it's a pause, is the fact that it's allowing conspiracy theorists to go crazy. I mean, just insane. So now they're talking about all of these anti-vax conspiracies, talking about, oh, it's the microchips that are in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that Gates has put in so he can track or he can eliminate anyone he does not want to be there, or he can force people to buy products that he wants them to buy. So, I mean, there are all sorts of difficulties. The concern with regard to vaccine passports, and I've heard such things as, well, this is actually going to turn out to be the mark of the beast. It's the satanic mark that shows that you are not God-fearing and that you are a supporter of Satan. So getting a vaccine, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So why doesn't a flu vaccine give you the same thing? So these people have just come out of the woodwork. But because there is something of a controversy, they will use that controversy to the greatest extent to convince people that there's something wrong with the vaccine and that they should not take it. And that is not the case. Again, Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, every medicine has a side effect, but every virus has difficulties. But with the COVID virus, the potential difficulty is death, and you can survive a side effect. You can't survive death. So I think we have to understand that. Now, what I expect with regard to the Johnson & Johnson, unless some other unforeseen difficulty occurs, I believe that it will be back into use in a relatively short period of time. The reason being that it is a single shot vaccine, which means it is advantageous for certain populations in certain areas. And the circumstance is that when we take a look at risk benefit, the risk of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is about 1 in 1 million. The risk with regard to COVID-19 is about 125 per million. So a big risk benefit difficulty. I'd also like to mention that if anyone has any questions about any of the things that I'm talking about, please feel free to chime in. So that's the situation with regard to the vaccine. So any questions about what I've just mentioned about the vaccines?
Go ahead,
We
Tom.
we can ask questions.
Sure.
All right. The first thing you brought up, the heparin, which sort of got my attention, and I think it's often administered by giving a shot into the abdomen or an injection. Now, 10, 12 years ago, we had in America people getting heparin in hospitals. About 800 died, and it was linked to the fact that the heparin is much of our, if not most of our drug products are made in China, and it was contaminated. And this was, well admitted. So the first thing I'm thinking about, we got this heparin relationship again. All right, well, maybe it isn't the heparin that's contaminated. Maybe it's the vaccine. At least it's raising the issue, not taking a side. You make you think, where's the problem at? Because you're still researching. And it raises the other issue. J&J has just come out, been out about a month or so. The others started in December. As you know, since early last year, Donald Trump, they shut down air traffic from China, and he declared a state of emergency. And on the basis of this emergency, we've got emergency use authorization for vaccines. So we are all in a clinical trial, right? We are all volunteer participants in this trial. And, and J&J has come out and we're seeing these effects. If you would have done animal studies, I understand you avoided animal studies this time. Previously, when there was animal studies with the coronavirus, right, with certain animals, there are these reports, right or wrong, that the animals died. So they skipped the animal trials. The trials are on us, human beings. So yours keep saying, well, we need more data. We got to collect. Yes, indeed. We're in a clinical trial. We're all volunteers, right? So, and did the government rush too quickly? Shouldn't the Food and Drug Administration do their usual procedure, decide whether it's ready for approval and licensing? I mean, it may turn out when these phase 3 trials end at the end of 2022 or into 2023, the FDA may not license one or more of these vaccines because of what it has inflicted during the trial period. This is how you learn. So, and here we have a virus, which you hear different reports with a death rate, less than 1%, and you have a vaccine. And if you go to the CDC's system, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and you look, they collect the VAERS, the Adverse Reporting System on Vaccines or whatever. And Bobby Kennedy's group, the Defender, Children's Health Defense, they collect all these and publish it. And they have a reporter there, Megan Redshaw, who's doing stories weekly and keeps asking the CDC for comment on why we've got thousands and thousands of injuries being reported with these vaccines and into the thousands of reported deaths, with 1/3 of these deaths happening within 48 hours after these vaccines are being administered. And there's no explanation. I understand it's self-reporting by physicians and patients and others. I also understand, and you would know on this, a Harvard study not too long ago on this reporting system, that they did the research, estimated that what we're seeing officially, the CDC, is only like something from 1% or 10% of the actual adverse events. All right. And the other thing that's happening, people are going to get these vaccines. There is no informed consent. I know if you look at some of the federal rules, they don't get a pamphlet on the advantages of taking this and the possible risk. They don't sign an informed consent. And so they just go in, roll up their sleeve and get the shot. Now, this is, you would say, those that would argue that this is medical experimentation without informed consent. This is an issue. And I come from journalism, all right? I worked for a big paper. I covered the medical system as part of it, what I call the medical industrial complex. I was shocked and overwhelmed by the amount of over-treatment, overuse of machinery, over unnecessary surgeries, and unnecessary deaths. And I know that the third leading cause of death in the United States after cancer and heart disease is medical treatment, drugs, intervention, all right? So we have a serious problem here. And then the worst of it all, coming from journalism, those physicians, and you know there are hundreds of them, who would be your so-called conspiracy theorists based on their clinical practice, are saying these therapeutics, and you're talking about vitamin D, are readily available. There's no need for the vaccine. They're being dismissed and marginalized. You've got big tech, you've got Facebook, you've got Google, along with CNN, New York Times. Those who are objecting, it seems to me that science is a democratic process, an adversarial process. If you get in the court, you have your medical experts on one side and you have your medical experts on the other. Well, those on the other side are not getting a voice. They're being deplatformed. Robert F. Kennedy is not allowed to be on Fox, for example. And Roger Ailes, who owned and ran Fox many years ago, he says, if any of my hosts got you on, I'd have to fire them. Why is that? Well, in this country, there's only two places in the world. One is New Zealand, the other is the United States, where big pharma can advertise on television. So why do they advertise on television? So they can control the content, say the critics, all right? And so, you identify people on CNN and they're this, they're that, and so forth, and they do not give the other side. So people are not being asked by the medical community to give informed consent. And I would say, and I'm hearing from you, and I'm glad you're talking, but I would say the expert in the state of Ohio on these vaccines is a physician up in Middleburg Heights, outside Cleveland, where I'm from, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. She has been studying vaccines for 20 years. She lectures at Cleveland State. She teaches over at the Case Western Reserve Medical School. She is being asked to go and give talks around the country. You can find her on YouTube. You can go to her website. Yet, the mainstream corporate media will not allow her to speak. Now, the best thing in the world, and I say to you, Dr. Fletcher, if we can ask Dr. Sherry Tenpenny to join our group and ask you to come back and have an actual discussion between two experts from both sides, then the American people get an idea to make up their mind whether they want these vaccines or not. I could go on for another 10 or 15 minutes, Dr. Fletcher, but I've taken too much of the time. But I just want you to know where I've come from, and I've done a lot of research on this. So back to you. Thank you.
Okay, so Tom, you've just gone for 10 minutes, and I got a question for you. Have you gotten any shots?
No, I'm in the control group.
Okay.
And
Tom, I'm going to ask you to wear your mask during this session.
Well,
anyhow, 4 to 6 months from now, we should meet again, because Dr. Tenpenny says when we go into the low vitamin D season, the flu season, is when that cyclone storm you're talking about, Dr. Fletcher, is going to happen. And I'm dreading what's going to happen this fall and winter. And Judy Mikovits, who's written a book, Plague of Corruption, and talks about how corrupt Anthony Fauci is, right or wrong. She was in the National Cancer Institute, Dr. Fletcher, different side of the story. She's predicting up into the millions of deaths from the vaccines. And when these deaths are happening in the fall and winter, it's not going to be blamed on the vaccines. It will be blamed on the viruses. And we need boosters, and we've got a third or fourth wave, and we need more shots. So that was the rest of what I was going to say. So that's it. I'm done. I'm just taking all this in. I don't know what the truth is, Dr. Fletcher. Please enlighten us.
well, first of all, you have to be aware of what your true source is. Again, I don't know the Kennedy gentleman that you're speaking of, but when you talk about all the deaths associated with vaccine, that's just not true. There have been no reports of death directly associated with the vaccinations, none. So again, well, now we're starting to see some of the phenomena associated with some of these side effects like the clotting and such. So again, we're updating our data. With regard to current status being that of a clinical study, it is not. The clinical study has been gone through. The clinical study looked at a number of individuals. It was performed in the fashion that all vaccine approvals need to be approved of. The manufacturing process, all of that has been gone through with great detail with regard to the FDA. To say that the need for informed consent, well, because it is an approved and because this is not a clinical study, then consents are really not necessary. It's kind of like saying, well, your dentist is going to give you some amoxicillin, so do you need a consent form for that? No, you don't. It's a therapeutic agent. So the other factor about science and clinical studies being a democratic process, no, they're an objective process that looks at outcomes, that looks at data, that is based on objective findings and not subjective findings. Democracy can be subjective. If you like one side more than the other side, then you're probably going to vote for the side you like and not the side that you don't like. When you're dealing with objective information, there are no sides, there's just information. If one side of the equation says 2 and the other side of the equation says 1, and you're trying to find out which side is greater, then you know objectively that 2 is greater than 1. So, again, you have a number of concerns, and I can be sensitive to all those concerns, but I have to look at it from a different standpoint. I have to look at it from a standpoint of public health. And to say that vitamin D is going to control the virus, no. I say it is complementary. It can help your body, but it will not substitute for therapy, and it will not substitute for a vaccine. So, like I said, there are a lot of things that you said. I can't say that I agree with the number of things, but I can't really answer all of those activities. But all I can say is that at this point, vaccines are necessary, and vaccines are our only hope at this period of time. There's not going to be any magic that's going to occur. This isn't going to disappear by itself. The body is not going to be able to recuperate by itself. And the topic that I want to get on now is one of the reasons why this is becoming a more serious concern, and that is mutations. Now, what we know is that viruses go into the cell and they cause the cell to make copies of themselves, multiple thousands and thousands of copies. And it's kind of like using a text. If you text very long letters, you're going to see that you misspelled some words, that the spell check will turn a word, say from public to pubic, or from let's see, what was the other example that I used? But you know that there are text changes that convey a different meaning. Well, that's what happens with all of this copying. There is copying error that occurs. So with each copying error, the virus has the potential to modify, to change itself. Some of these changes are called drifts, and they're minor changes. Some of these changes are called shifts, and they're major changes. Now, what we've noticed is that there have been a number of mutations that have given us pause to be very concerned. The UK variant is one of those changes, and we know it's in Ohio. It was discovered in Columbus months ago. And what happens if we do not have adequate protection and that variant becomes the predominant or the dominant species, then we're going to have more difficulties, because that mutation tends to be more transmittable and is also more serious. So we know that essentially it is affecting the United States, and it's affecting Ohio, and the fact that we see that the greatest number of hospitalizations, which with the original form was noted in the elderly population. Now we're noting that the number of hospitalizations, the greatest number, are in people that are between the ages of 20 and 39. And that's because young people tend to converge and they probably haven't been vaccinated. they're getting together and they're spreading the disease. And because what they're spreading now is the more virulent difficulty. So we can't really say 100% just what the improvement is going to be with regard to the vaccines, but we do know that vaccines give protection. And the protection that has been noted with regard to the original studies have been in the 90% range. For the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's been in the high 70%. And that's far greater than what we see with our annual flu vaccines. Flu vaccines can have an effective rate of only 10%. In general, it's probably around 40 to 50%. So to have a vaccine that gives such high percentages of efficacy is pretty much a new gold standard. But again, we have to get more information about what these variants are doing. Now, there's another variant, and that's the South African mutation. And all these mutations seem to have arisen independently. They're not interactive parts. So this mutation has the potential to evade the immune system and evade the vaccines. To what extent, we don't have a lot of information, although we do know that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was used in this, and it had probably a greater than 50% efficacy in that particular type of variant. Now, when we take a look at mutations, we've done some statistical work, and we find that there are probably around 3,800 possible variants that can occur. We know, for instance, with regard to the South African, we've used one of the immune therapies, Regeneron, which has been touted as an effective medication by itself. I don't really see that great of an improvement with it, but it does offer some therapy for this. So what we know with the South African variant, it probably is less effective. Regeneron is less effective, and the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine are also less effective. And we're going to find out more information as this continues. The other vaccine, the other mutation is the Brazil mutation. And the Brazil mutation was an aspect of very poor handling of the difficulty with COVID in Brazil. And that difficulty is the fact that the leaders of that country allow the vaccine to essentially spread wild. And because of that, it very quickly became the dominant species of virus, the more deadly vaccine. And so this has caused it to spread at a greater rate. It's also caused it to have a number of other phenomena. It's 2.5 times more transmittable than the original COVID-19. And now we're starting to see something that they call a double mutation in India. And India is going through some very, very difficult times with regard to vaccines. We will continue to see mutations with regard to what's going on. Mutations can go in both directions. Mutations can make a virus worse, or mutations can make a virus better. Because of the nature of the disease, we tend to focus our attention on the ones that are worse, because those are the ones that are going to cause us the most difficulty. At this time, I can say that the vaccines give us protection against that, but to what degree it's going to pan out and to what degree it's going to occur with regard to all these new variants, I don't know. I'm sure the South African variation is in the United States. I'm sure the Brazilian variation is in the United States. And I'm sure that any Indian variation is going to be in the United States. We take a look at China now, and we see that they are starting to look at another type of COVID-19 like virus. And this is in bats, but we know that if it's in bats, at some point in time, it has the potential of coming in contact with humans and being humans. They've actually defined this as disease X, because X stands for unexpected. So it's a potential unexpected next pandemic. I've also talked about the factor that we have such a dependence on chickens, and chickens are the source of viral contamination in the form of an avian influenza. We noted, and I gave a presentation at the University of Dayton, we noticed that there were 4 Russian farmers who had come down with a chicken type avian virus in March of this year. So there are a lot of other viruses that are on the forefront, but certainly we have to keep our attention to what's here now. Now, you talked about booster shots. Because this virus is changing, because we have to anticipate that what we have been given as a vaccine at this time may not have the efficacy later on. In our studies, we know that the vaccines offer at least 6 months of protection. Beyond that, we still don't have the information. And so it looks as though that probably at some time in the future, probably in the fall or winter, we're going to need a 3rd shot, a booster. And there are already companies, Moderna, for instance, is already looking at that 3rd shot. So that is probably our potential, that we're going to need something else. The other thing is that COVID-19 is now endemic. What does endemic mean? Endemic means that the disease is in a population in a certain geographic area. And since this is a pandemic, that geographic area is the world, and that population is everyone. And so it is part of what we are, part of where we live, part of our environment, part of our nature. And so the potential is that every year, just like we take our annual flu shots, we may have to take an annual COVID shot. So that's kind of the future. I'd like also to talk about other types of therapies, and vaccines certainly are one area to try to protect, try to help the body, just like nutrition and supplements try to help the body, but in a more direct fashion. Vaccines are very effective, but what happens if you're, I always used to tell my cancer patients, yes, I understand, I'm telling you that this is a 1 chance in 100, but what you want to know is, what's the case if you're that one person? If you're that one person, it's a 100% chance. So we need effective therapies, and we're working on effective therapies. With regard to oncology, we found that single drugs gave limited efficacy, but were promising. And so we took a look at a number of drugs that attacked the cancer in different ways, and we developed multi-drug therapy. And that led to greater and greater efficacy and even cures. When the AIDS epidemic was around, I talked about the fact that no single agent is going to be effective. We're going to have to use multi-drug therapy. And so the highly effective retrovirus therapies have been developed. They're multi-drug therapies. And so I would say the same thing with regard to COVID. We're probably going to need multi-drug therapies. And that's what they're working on now. They're looking at a number of drugs that have been used before, including hydroquinone, including Regeneron, Invectin, which is another parasitic drug, and combine it with other things. And so they've come up with this new term, which is multifaceted, highly targeted, sequential multi-drug treatment. So it's kind of like the heart, highly effective. So they're looking at these combination therapies to see if they can be effective. And they have seen a lot of efficacy. And they're looking at particularly a 3-drug regimen, I believe, that is coming out. And so I'm in hopes that we will have a good efficacy with regard to medications that directly attack and destroy the virus, to go along with the vaccines, to go along with the nutrition, to go along with the supplement. I would say that no one thing should be our absolute focus. I think we have to look at a number of different options. Certainly, staying healthy and having the right nutrition is going to help. Certainly, getting a vaccine which teaches the body to recognize the virus and to destroy it is important. And thirdly, to have a therapy in which once someone has the disease, that we can intervene in a fashion that will be able to help them recover in the best and shortest period of time. Now, the last thing I want to mention is how to prepare for the next pandemic, because it's just a matter of time before another pandemic is going to occur. And we have to be on the alert for that. So the first thing I would say is stay young and healthy. So don't age, stay in your 20s and 30s, keep your immune system, in great shape. But if you can't do that, then you need to do a couple of other things. First of all, you need to be prepared to treat at home, because medical care and medical supplies will be in shortage, just like we saw and are seeing with regard to our ICU beds and our respirators and our other medications. Have a good supply of effective face masks and disposable gloves. If you've got leftovers, keep them, because you're going to need them sometime in the future. Plan to have a sick room. So if someone gets ill, plan to have an area in which they can be isolated to protect other members of the household from that. Stock up on food, water, household supplies. I mentioned in my UD lecture, not just toilet paper. I don't understand why everyone goes crazy about getting toilet paper, but I understand the philosophy between panic buying. You go to the store, you see everyone grabbing toilet paper, and you say, hey, I better get some of that myself. So, there are other things that are also important. You need to also make emergency plans for childcare, money supply, to watch out for high risk or at-risk family members or neighbors. Again, you need to explore natural and herbal medicines, the so-called complementary alternative therapies, because a number of them can be beneficial. Now, again, I am not saying that or advocating that these are absolute therapies that work 100% time. No, I'm saying they can be helpful in giving the body the necessity that are essential for treating these diseases. You need to prepare mentally as well as socially and physically for this. So many people were not prepared for what has happened with regard to this vaccine, with this pandemic. And so people have had a lot of depression, suicides, a number of difficulties. Children are having great difficulties with that. So we have to find a way of mentally preparing ourselves. We need to, and Sarah, I would say that this is something that is very, very critical. We need to identify a reliable source for information. And that source should not be the web. That source should be some type of scientific journal, some type of expert opinion. And again, your comments about Dr. Fauci, or the comments of someone about Dr. Fauci, I've known Dr. Fauci for a long time. He is an excellent individual. To say that he is without blemish, I don't think anybody can say they're without blemish. But as far as expertise with regard to infectious diseases and this type of definition, he's the best in the world. So I listened to him. Certainly I listened and I questioned everything. I would question anybody. The doctor that you mentioned in Cleveland, be happy to talk to her, but I would question her, because to assume and to accept something without question leaves you vulnerable. And so question everything and make sure your source is appropriate. There's another thing that I would mention is that with this virus, if we, we're older folks, we're retired. So if we have the option, it's probably best to move to some Pacific island, because there are about 15 places in the world that have no COVID. One of them is North Korea, and we know that that is just not the case, that they are, simply not sharing their information. But the other places are remote islands like Pitcairn Island in the Pacific that's far away from other places. There's also a beautiful island that I actually thought about going when I was very, very young to practice in, and that is Peo Peo or Pango Pango, which is actually an American territory. And so moving to there, you don't lose any of your US rights. So those are some of the things. But the other thing that we have to do as a country is we have to make sure that we have the proper infrastructure, which means we now know that with these terrible viruses, we need hospital beds, we need ICU beds. And so we have to prepare for that. We have to understand that special training is necessary, and the training that people had before this COVID was inadequate. We saw a number of instances in which the virus was allowed to spread because people did not handle these individuals, did not handle effective materials in a proper fashion. And we need to go back to something which is taught to every basic healthcare professional, and that's called universal precautions. And universal precautions say, assume something may be wrong and prepare yourself. So if you see something that's wet and drippy and it's in a clean hotel, don't assume that it's not dirty. If you see something that's wet and drippy and you see it in a dirty motel, well, you kind of think, maybe treat them both as suspicious. Wear gloves, protect yourself, and to be cautious in a universal fashion. And with that, I will say, any questions?
Okay, Mary Ann, I want to go to you here. What can I mention?
Well, I'm wondering, Dr. Fletcher, do you think we'll reach the stage of herd immunity with all the people who don't want to get the vaccine?
I think between the factor that there are people that are just, anti-vaxxers, and that percentage is pretty high. I think it's like 25% or more.
Yeah.
We probably need to get over 70% with regard to herd immunity. And if enough people don't get it, and those are people that don't want it. Remember, there's also a group that does not have access, and so they can't get it. And so we have to make sure that we equitably distribute the vaccine so that those individuals who have poor access can get access, because we need as high a percentage of individuals who are protected by the vaccine as possible to get this artificially induced herd immunity. Otherwise, then it's going to continue to be around. And remember, the longer it's around, the more it mutates. And the more it mutates, the more it has a potential to become something far more deadly and far more transmittable.
Okay, how about Yellow Springs News?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Is that how I'm being identified?
Not
Okay.
you, your daughter.
Oh, yeah. That's where I'm at.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can't.
Oh, is she here?
Yeah,
I am
can you see her?
Thank you. Yes, so I'm actually in that age range for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, 18 to 48, female, on day 9, so no symptoms yet. Was wondering if you have any suggestions for anything I can do. But a second question would be, I'm just wondering if the fact that it was a single dose is a factor, that that it was just too strong for many people's bodies. If Johnson & Johnson was a 2-dose, if it had a better outcome. Thanks.
No, the statistics suggest that it gave great efficacy with 1 dose. And so that gave it an advantage for individuals who are, in poor access places. But they designed it to be a single shot, and the results of a single shot proved to be, greater than 70%. So that's excellent information. With regard to what you need to do, as I said, the potential for this to happen is approximately 1 in 1 million. And so what you have to be concerned with is any unusual symptoms such as severe headaches, any severe bruising, any severe pain in the face or the head, any unusual or severe gastric GI symptoms, and any type of bruising that is in excess that you should watch out for. But generally, we have found that the phenomena usually occurs in a matter of 6 to 13 days. So you're pretty close to being out of the window.
Tony, you have any comments or questions?
Yes, I was thinking about the 60 Minutes this past Sunday. And they interviewed a researcher who's in charge of viruses research. And he was talking about they're on the cusp edge of developing the processes where virtually all viruses will be eliminated. Have you heard of anything like that, Dr. Fletcher?
I've been hearing about all cancers will eventually be eliminated. All heart disease will virtually be eliminated. All colds and flus will virtually be eliminated. And, you know, when we're all dead, yes, they will be eliminated. But quite frankly, I don't see that happening. As I mentioned, viruses are very, very difficult to treat. And when we think about viruses, one scientist gave it in a more poetic fashion. He stated that there are more viruses on Earth than there are stars in the sky. And that is the case. There are trillions of viruses. So to say that we're going to come up with some common therapy to take care of trillions of different species, it ain't going to happen. So I think that certainly there will be more universal vaccines and therapies that can treat multiple types of viruses, but to say every type of virus, no. The other thing is viruses can do positive things. And so to destroy every virus on Earth might have, in the long run, a negative effect. You know, we have evolved in a certain way because of viruses. Those individuals who could not survive the virus died out. And those individuals who could survive the virus and had stronger immune systems survived. And we are the result of those individuals that had the stronger survival immune systems. And that will continue to happen. So if we destroy the viruses, how's that going to affect evolution? I don't know, but it certainly can.
I'm going to go to Brian. Brian Jarvis, you joined us a little bit later, but what are your comments or questions?
Yes, I had a question. I wanted to switch my question now to follow up on the doctor's just statement. If, as you just mentioned, survival is that evolutionary process, is what's happening right now survival of the fittest? Is that what's going on?
Well, you know, essentially survival of the fittest happens every day from the standpoint of medicine, because we are impacted by so many things, bacteria, and now we're running into the difficulty of antibody resistant bacteria. And so that's going to be a common concern in the future. Viruses, heart disease, cancer, kidney disease. So we're faced with these things all the time. And so every day, you might say, is a survival advantage day. Every day that you survive, then you pass that survival protection to your ancestors.
Okay, I'm going to go to number 19377. Questions or comments?
Yeah, no, the name is Mike, by the way. I don't know why the 19377 started coming up on this a couple weeks ago.
You could change your
Tony.
name very easily if you go up to that little blue, the little square up, put your hover.
The question isn't, hopefully you guys didn't cover this already, ivermectin. I've read some stuff as they're being used even in a prophylactic setting in Mexico and India, but flat out as a treatment. And although it's from an economics blog, the information that they linked to seemed to be pretty positive. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, we've had some interest in these anti-parasitic medications. Hydroquinone was a anti-malarial drug that has also been used with other inflammatory disorders like rheumatoid arthritis. And it showed some promise, although in the long run, not sufficient. as a treatment. Ivermectin is also in that category. It's also an antiparasitic agent. And we have seen some early data to suggest that it is effective. However, as I mentioned before, I do not think one single drug is going to be the therapeutic optimal. I think what we'll have to see is we'll have to use drugs like ivermectin and perhaps an antibiotic like azithromycin. Those combinations have been used and other combinations are being studied this time. So I read some information that there's preliminary data that a combination of at least 3 drugs has shown some very good efficacy. And when that data comes out, we'll take a look at that. But again, it's interesting to note that a class of drug, these antiparasitics, has shown efficacy. And one would think, let's take a look at perhaps some of these other antiparasitics that are similar to the hydro and the ivermectin and try to see if perhaps they may add something.
Okay, yes.
Ron, I'm going to ask you one question here. What would your recommended dosage of a vitamin D, how many international units daily, and calcium as well, what would you say?
With regard to vitamin D, and again, D3 is probably better than D2 because D3, there have been studies and we found out that the length of efficacy tends to be longer with D3. The difference between D3 and D2 is derived from plants, D3 is derived from animals. So D3 is the preferable, and the dosage should be around 1,000 to 2,000 international units a day. There was question about doses over 4,000 units having some side effects, but there's been recent data to suggest that that's probably not the case. But to stay in the acceptable range, I'd say the dosage of 1,000 to 2,000 a day is probably very, very safe and very, very effective. But
okay, so
one other thing that I would mention, that's assuming that you have a good level of vitamin D. So to be absolutely sure, you need to have your vitamin D level checked. And if it is low, then there are high doses of vitamin D, 50,000 unit doses that can be given by prescription that can raise your level to an acceptable range. And then you can continue to maintain it with that 1,000, 2,000 level.
okay, so 5,000 would be too much, I would guess.
5,000 would probably, yeah, that would not be recommended.
Okay. I'm going to go to Tom. Tom, do you have any final questions or comments?
Yes, I do. I was going to ask the second part of the presentation, but I want to go back to a follow-up of what I asked last time with Dr. Fletcher's answer. And that's the thing, reporting the adverse reporting system, adverse events, and the deaths being listed, the serious injuries, there's various kinds, is something the CDC collects. And I think you're right, Dr. Fletcher. You can't say any of these people died because of the vaccine, or excuse me, the vaccine. I'm talking about the virus. So that means the first time I saw somebody end up dying was television live. Actually, it was ended up as YouTube. A nurse manager, 30 years old, in a hospital in southern Tennessee, is getting the shot live. All right, and they're promoting the vaccine, and she passes out while being interviewed by the newsman, and she's caught by the security guard and the others, and of course they flash away. And the story, or some would say cover story of the hospital, was that's her reaction to pain. And then you couldn't get, the media couldn't get any information more from the hospital, what happened to her, how she's doing. And finally, a British paper, it was a Daily News or whatever, they actually sent reporters over, and they went down into the archives. She lived in Alabama, just over the line. She had died 3 days after she got that vaccine shot live. Now, you would of course say that's associated in time, but that's not a cause and effect. I don't know of anybody doing autopsies and finding the virus or whatever in it. And so what they're reporting is deaths happening soon after. And what they're reporting is people getting serious reactions soon after they get the vaccine shot. Now, there are some doctors out there, Dr. Andrew Kaufman, you can find him, MD, out of New York City, Dr. Thomas Cohen, who maintain you guys are wrong on the germ theory of the virus, which is what the Rockefellers picked up 100 years ago when they started doing vaccines, and they were available for World War I when we had this so-called Spanish flu. And there are others that are saying that a virus means poison. Corona, of course, means like radiation if you look into it, but that there's a great poisoning coming on. And these viruses are exosomes. They're created by our immune system in reaction to being poisoned chemically, biologically, and especially in today's world, electromagnetically. And these physicians that I've just named and others will give long lectures explaining what exosomes are. The germ theory is very convenient for big pharma making billions of dollars. And as you know, we've been talking about Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson is a convicted criminal organization. I think they hid the talcum powder causing cancer for decades and other things. They've paid out billions in fines. If we look at these people we're putting our lives in, they've all been convicted of major crimes. Not to mention the opioid crisis and who was behind that and what they're paying out. So how can we trust these people? And how can we trust the medical establishment to stand up to a corrupt big pharma? Can we trust the government? Where do we go, Dr. Fletcher? And that's the essence of my question. And there's some other things to bring up, but that's enough. Please answer me on that and put my mind at ease.
Well, as far as trust is concerned, again, as I think I mentioned, question everything. I really suggest you strongly question everything. But the data that you receive, the data that I have received, suggests that the vaccines are, from the standpoint of risk benefit, have far greater benefits. Certainly, if you take an aspirin, you can bleed to death. If you take a certain medicine, you can have an allergic reaction and die. But, people have, Tylenol causes liver failure. So people take Tylenol and aspirin every day and they don't think about it. They don't die, but some people do die. The drug companies certainly have financial influences, but they're individuals, and I was one of those individuals that monitored the adverse events, that monitored the difficulties, that went into very deep investigation as to why an individual had a side effect or died from a difficulty, and tried to find out very, very thoroughly what the dangers were. I've worked with the company in which we saw some signs of a difficulty and we pulled that drug from the market because we did not want the risk of people dying or having severe difficulties from a product that we have. And I've worked for Johnson & Johnson. Certainly there are individuals that are, that are pushed by greed, pushed by fear, pushed by, the need to succeed, and they do unethical things, but they are rare. The majority of individuals, the folks like me, the frontline people that are going out to get the data, we go out to get the data, we do the work, we stay up all night long, we read, we do hours and hours and days of research to find out what is going to be best for people. Because we don't want someone to die. We don't want someone to become blind. We don't want someone to have a stroke. We don't want someone to have some debilitating difficulties. We want them to be well. We see this as being a fight against the disease, and we want to win. And we want to win at the best optimal outcome. And that's to win without having to have any casualties. So, that's my philosophy. That's the philosophy of all the people that I have worked with. With regard to your comment about the exosome, a virus is an attacking organism. We're not quite sure even if it's live. It doesn't have all of the qualifications that we use to determine a living organism, but what it does seems to suggest that it has some component of life. But viruses are real. Polio was real, and a vaccine did an amazing job of preventing polio from spreading through the United States. I was one of those kids that got one of those first vaccines, and I saw lots of kids faint when they got the vaccine. The nurse that you mentioned, the fact that as the needle went into her arm, she fainted, that's not the medicine, that's her. That's just fact. Unless, of course, something else happened, like she was so afraid that she had a heart attack or something of that nature. But again, we can go into all of this and all the details of that, but like I said, the industry for the greatest amount is interested in the welfare and the safety and the health of everyone. And being a part of that industry, that is what I always try to advocate, and all of my associates try to advocate. Certainly there are outliers. There are always outliers. There are good priests and bad priests. There are good lawyers and bad lawyers. There are good police and bad police. But again, we have to take a look at the overall outcomes. And the overall outcomes of medicines and pharma and physicians and healthcare workers has been very, very much on the positive safety, well-being side.
Okay,